years. So pretty much he's an expert on the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. And to give you an idea of some of his credentials, he's a certified specialist in criminal law. He's nationally and internationally known. He's on trial advocacy, immigration, history of the Bill of Rights. And he does have a book for sale back here on the Bill of Rights, which I highly recommend. Taught in Latin America on criminal prosecution and trial advocacy. He's been in 7 countries where he's taught in South and Central America. Okay. He was named the Southwest Super Lawyer. That's he's going to have to explain that. And Phoenix St. Thomas More Award, past president of the Arizona Zonans for the Criminal Justice, a supervising attorney at ASU, a law alumni group, published the Criminal Lawyer's Guide to Immigration. We really need that. The Citizenship Flowchart and the Bill of Rights, Quill's Stills history of the Bill of Rights. He's a lawyer we can respect. You know, many of us aren't that keen on lawyers, but this is one of the good ones. Okay, so I give you Bob McWhirter. Okay.
And I'm waiting for the screen to automatically project as well. Before we begin, I'd like to do a couple things. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge my former boss, former Chief Justice Stanley Feldman is in the back. And yes. And also, I would not know Stanley Feldman without his wife, Norma, who is also there as well. So if you, Stanley had a great effect on my constitutional thinking. So if you like this talk that I'm going to give, you should give some gratitude to him. Conversely, if you dislike the talk, it's all his fault. Well, while he's doing that, does anybody have any questions generally about the Bill of Rights? The question is, could I fill in on the background of why the writers were so keen on those particular things? And again, that's not the subject of my talk, so I'm happy to fill time in here. There was a long history going with that, kind of culminating in the English Bill of Rights almost 100 years earlier. Okay, so that's that one. And so there was a tradition from which they were working. So for instance, the 8th Amendment is almost exactly like the English Bill of Rights version of it. So there was a history from which they're dealing. And their big claim was, oh, we just want the rights of Englishmen. So, at least at the start of the revolutionary generation, that's what we were talking about. Just give us what we have. And then the conclusion, if you read the Declaration of Independence, it's very clear. You haven't given us those. In other words, the Declaration of Independence kind of has 2 parts. The first is this kind of cool language, self-evident truths, all that stuff. Then it goes into what would essentially be an indictment. And it's an indictment of King George III, and for failing to do all of these things. Many of what's in the Bill of Rights you can trace right back to a corollary, which is in the Declaration of Independence. So that's generally how that happened. Another question while we are waiting for the technology. Yeah. The question is, the Second Amendment, the next part of it says a well-regulated militia. Now I got a whole other talk on the Second Amendment called Shooting Your Mouth Off About the Second Amendment, which I enjoy that talk, although I'm a little nervous because I think it's the only presentation that could actually get me shot. So the question is, how is it that they ignored that second part, a well-regulated militia being necessary to a free state? What I conclude in that talk, well, first of all, how is it they can ignore it? The Supreme Court just kind of does what it wants to do on these things, and these things go through interpretation. For years, for the worst of reasons, it had declared that the Second Amendment was really about a collective right in the militia, a well-regulated militia. And I say it's for the worst of reasons because the case that was the start of that, Cruikshank, had to do with disarming black people, fundamentally. So now eventually you get to Heller, and Heller says you have an individual right to bear arms, and that's the current interpretation. I am less excited about that than I am at the thought that this can be the vehicle to re-examine Cruikshank and the interpretation of the Civil War amendments to basically say they don't mean what they mean, which is everybody's supposed to have equal rights in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, all right? So the Second Amendment, what I conclude is, yeah, I think that it gives you an individual right, but like all rights, it is a regulated right. Even free speech is regulated. There are regulations, and by the way, and if you bring me here to talk about the Second Amendment, just forget what I'm saying because I don't want to steal my own thunder. During the time of the founding, if you want to go to an originalist argument, what did the framers intend? They intended gun control. There was gun control both in the type of firearm that you could have, or at least how it was stored, black powder, all kinds of regulations. You could get any gun you wanted, but you had regulations as to where you kept it, and also who could own a gun. No black people could own guns. Indentured servants. In fact, the area of the country that had the most gun control was the Deep South, which is the area of the country that's most against gun control today. But the history of the framers were all, and I'm not just talking about slaves, all black people were prevented from owning firearms. So once you say that the framers did have gun control, it's a question of what is appropriate gun control today, recognizing, as the Supreme Court tells us we must, that it is an individual right. And by the way, you can go into a lot of analysis about what an individual right is. Okay, I can take you back to Plato. I can take you back to Aristotle, through the Romans, through Cicero. You want a nice rule of thumb about what an individual right is? Anything black people didn't get, that's it. So that would be how I would be my rule of thumb. Another question? Yes? There's a bunch of rights that aren't in the Bill of Rights, like the right to privacy, the right to be ignored. Most of us get ignored and we don't consider it a right, but okay, fine. So, yeah, for that, you have to go to the 9th and 10th Amendments. And what those say is, especially the 9th Amendment, this is incorporation of concepts of natural law. And so whatever rights that you, and by the way, you can bring me here to talk about those two too. I have complete talks on that as well. But whatever rights you don't, that aren't articulated, you get anyway. You just naturally have them. They're inalienable or unalienable to you. So although the Constitution doesn't list them, in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton talked about this. See, one of the arguments was, oh, isn't it terrible? Oh, wait. Okay, both Hamilton and Madison said, oh, we don't need a Bill of Rights because the constitutional structure gives us a Bill of Rights, and if you list rights, everything you don't list, the government will just take. Therefore, that's good why we don't have a Bill of Rights, so pass the Constitution like it is, right? Nobody bought that. Okay, the Constitution was ready to go down in flames, and James Madison, for a number of complicated reasons, decided to be a champion of a Bill of Rights. So once the Constitution got in, James Madison became part of the first Congress. He was the one, as a campaign promise, pushed through the Bill of Rights, and so it's essentially part of the same thing. But that included then the 9th and especially the 10th Amendments to answer, it was kind of Madison's answer to himself. When he said, oh, we don't need a Bill of Rights, well, the 10th Amendment said, yeah, we really do need a Bill of Rights. What makes me such an activist on the Bill of Rights? The passion for it? I'm not sure. I've never been asked that question before. I mean, but, you know, really, when you think about it, if it means anything to be an American, this is what it means. I mean, this is essential to what we're about. And what I worry about is there's just not much civic education going on anymore. And so that's what I wrote the book, why I wrote the book. Also, you know, I'm in legal circles, and I read a lot of Supreme Court opinions, and there's all this stuff about originalism, okay? I consider myself an originalist, but when you start to go down the originalist road, what are you really talking about? Most people, let me just give you one example. The greatest fear of the founders was the fear of a standing army. Now, most originalists don't advocate we should get rid of the army. And most of us are okay that the Seventh Fleet is out there in the Gulf. Okay? But the framers would have found that horrible. So if you want to go to the original intent on everything, it's just not going to be the country that we want to live in. So a lot of originalist arguments are made to bludgeon certain social programs or whatever. Well, in reality, I think that's inappropriate. And if you actually look at what the original intent was, and I'll deal with at least one instance here, it just doesn't carry through. There's a lack of consistency in the originalist position. All right. All right. Well, anyway, that's my book, by the way. And these, okay. These are my children. If you'd like to help support these beautiful children, I've got the book on sale for $30. If you want to keep them from a life of crime and dissipation, if I sell enough books, I can afford to send them to trade school. All right. Okay, of course, of dogma and desire, saying what you believe about the First Amendment. If you notice, there was a list on your kind of brochure for this of all the things that I was going to talk about today. I could have you here till 6 tonight if you want me to try to get all of those things, in which case, let's just order pizza, all right? So I've had to be somewhat selective on the list, and I'm going to basically focus on the First Amendment part of religion. And to begin that, I'll talk about a kid. A kid gets suspended up in Alaska. And what he gets suspended for is this banner that they unfurled at an on-campus event, Bong Hits for Jesus. Now, does anybody know about this Bong Hits for Jesus thing? Okay, I went on the web, and this is a thing, Bong Hits for Jesus. Begging the question is, are we talking about free speech or religion with that? His suspension is increased from 5 to 10 days after he quotes from Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson did probably not ever use a bong, although he did grow marijuana on the plantation at Monticello, okay? Now, the people from normalization of marijuana people will give you a big, long lecture about how Thomas Jefferson and George Washington all grew marijuana. To be honest, they did, but they really weren't interested in the same part of the plant that the folks from Normal were interested in. Okay, they were more interested in the hemp as a kind of a crop, an industrial crop. You know, you can do all kinds of things with hemp. Okay. The case is Morris versus Frederick. It goes all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The kid loses in the Supreme Court of the United States. He, however, wins under the Alaska Constitution free speech provisions. In Alaska, a big judgment about his right to free speech. One of the leaders of this, of course, again, I'll refer to Justice Stanley Feldman, about the fact that you have dual protections for your rights, not just the federal Constitution, but your state constitutions as well. So, what's it about? The First Amendment, Bong Hits for Jesus, is front and center of the culture debates. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. We often view the First Amendment as actually two different amendments. I can speak specifically in law school. You spend several weeks in Constitutional Law Class 2 talking about freedom of religion and the free exercise of religion clause. Then you kind of put that aside and talk about the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. And they're almost dealt like they're two different amendments. In reality, the First Amendment emerged because of the interaction between the two. And that often gets lost. This was the last chapter in the book that I wrote. By far, it was the most difficult to conceptualize because I had to get a hold of this material, and I finally decided, put them together. Treat the two together to the extent that I could. So, under the First Amendment, we print, blog, speak, protest, petition, argue, and march. What motivates us to do those things are our creeds. We demand to freely exercise our creed and to be free from somebody else establishing a creed over us, which creates a real problem, especially in the culture debates, because many people have the creed that they have to convert you to their thought in order to fulfill their free exercise. So in a sense, you always have the free exercise. I see a lot of heads nodding about that one, right? You have the free exercise clause always butting up against the establishment clause. The First Amendment's always butting up against itself. The First Amendment defines us. It was James Madison's personal project. By the way, the First Amendment wasn't originally first. A lot of people don't. There was an amendment regarding the size of Congress that never passed, and the original Second Amendment related to congressional pay. It eventually became the 27th Amendment and was passed in 1992. But before World War I, the federal courts did not generally protect the right of free speech. The First Amendment is truly the heart of the Bill of Rights, according to Hugo Black, but in reality it took, again, the Civil War amendments to give it anything of the scope that James Madison intended it to have. It defines us. Bong hits for Jesus. I call this a little turning point in history. In a sense, it has something in common with Sir Thomas More, who in 1535 defied King Henry VIII, which I call a big, fat turning point in history. I die the king's good servant and God's first. And of course, the man for all seasons, it still stands up even today. Great costuming, by the way. All right, Henry VIII is out on that. The irony of this, of course, is that Thomas More, in this mix of speech and religion, got executed not for what he said, but for what he didn't say. He refused to swear the oaths supporting, well, Henry VIII's hostile takeover of the Church of England. Speech, like the religion, can be symbolic as well as spoken. This is Thomas More when he was Speaker of the House, standing up against Cardinal Wolsey. Wolsey was so impressed with him that he decided to hire him and put him in the king's service. Speech and religion. Okay, before Thomas More got his head chopped off the night before, Henry VIII sent him a letter, his former friend, and says, "The king's pleasure is further that at your execution you shall not use many words. Don't embarrass me after I went to all the trouble to kill you," is the message. Of course, Thomas More just simply said, "I die the king's good servant and God's first." We remember what Thomas More says. See, Thomas More was a precursor. He knew a good soundbite. And you don't need to use a lot of words to make your point. Misuse of government power, particularly in times of stress, has brought suffering to humanity in all ages, about which we have authentic history. Some of the world's noblest and finest men have suffered ignominy and death for no crime unless unorthodoxy is a crime. Okay, clauses for causes. Why is the First Amendment structured the way it is? There's the Establishment Clause. See, Henry VIII established himself as the Pope in England. He didn't have any big theological problem with the Catholic Church, other than the Catholic Church just wouldn't theologically give him a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. But in terms of the theology, he didn't care about that. He just thought he should be Pope in England. That is why we have an anti-establishment clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Henry and his successors, however, did not know what they got themselves into, because once you break with Rome, you not only had to suppress all the remaining Catholics, you had to suppress everybody else who had different Protestant ideas. It was from that tension is why we have a free exercise clause. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion, because that's exactly what Henry and his successors tried to do. Free speech. The dissenters wouldn't shut up. This happens to be John Lilburn. Despite the Crown's and the established church best effort to suppress them, that's why we have a free speech clause. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. They continued to write pamphlets, and the kings continued to burn them, both the Puritans and the pamphlets, which is why we have a free press clause. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of the press. They petitioned for their rights, which the Crown and Church ignored. This is the Petition of Right of 1628, one of the precursors to, as with your question, to the Bill of Rights. That is why we have the right to assemble and petition. Congress shall make no law respecting the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. What pushed the revolution of rights? Certainly for men like Jefferson, Adams, and Madison, it was the Enlightenment. This idea of kind of rational, different way of doing things. But if you look at American history, it was not the Enlightenment that really pushed this idea of rights. Karl Marx, religion is the sign of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Well, quite frankly, the greatest refutation of Karl Marx's statement is the American experience. It wasn't a philosophy that pushed the rights, including the right to speak. It was religion in all of its different manifestations. Now in that, Free Thought Arizona can be a religion too. It's whatever your creed is that matters. All right. Well, let's talk about this wall separating church and state. Now, the framers of the Constitution and the Puritan founders before them knew their biblical history. Okay? The Hebrews, God made the judges and later the kings separate from the priests. Samuel lays down the law for Saul. Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of thy Lord thy God, which he commandeth thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever, but now thy kingdom shall not continue. Samuel decided, or rather Saul burnt some incense before a battle because Samuel was late. And so Samuel got pretty annoyed with that. That's why Saul lost the kingdom. Later on, when the priest got wind of Judean king Uzziah burning incense to God in the temple, it was bad news for him. And they withstood Uzziah the king and said unto him, It appertaineth not unto thee, Uzziah, to burn incense unto the Lord, but to the priests, the sons of Aaron. Go out of the sanctuary, for thou hast trespassed. For overstepping his jurisdiction, Uzziah got leprosy. But this is an early precursor to the notions that church and state need to be separate. What were those kings trying to do? They were trying to get a little God power. The priests were protecting the religion. The kings were trying to steal the God power. Separation of church and state is to protect the church from this perspective. What do we have at the Air Force Academy? This issue about, I guess they have some graduation ceremony or something where they dip the flag to the cross or something like that, and other cadets are saying, whoa, I take an oath to defend the country, not necessarily the cross. So this is all about trying to sneak in God power. I could give you a great speech about this, but I can't do it as well as Abraham Lincoln did in his second inaugural address. Both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. That's what happens when you start playing with too much God power. By the way, I also like Abraham Lincoln's. One, I think he's one of the most brilliant writers that ever lived. But I like the way he kind of sticks this little passive-aggressive jab at the Confederacy and then says, well, let's not judge, least not we be judged. All right, fine. All right. So this goes to the Ten Commandments in the public square. Monument at the Texas State Capitol. Van Oden versus Perry said that was okay. By the way, this exact same copy of this you will also find at Wesley Boland Plaza in Phoenix at the state capitol. McCready County display was considered to be not constitutional of the same Ten Commandments. Now, if you notice, these two cases happened right after each other. They were reported right after each other. And I'm sure the Supreme Court thought, hey, this is a great teaching moment. We can have these two little cases and show people how one is good. Most people just said, we're just totally baffled how one can be and one cannot be. All right. Well, here's why. This monument was placed with a secular purpose. That's what the court found. And if you place the Ten Commandments with a secular purpose, then that's okay. If you are a government entity and place it with a religious proselytizing purpose, that is not okay. See, that was placed for a religious purpose. So what was the secular purpose? Well, the Fraternal Order of Eagles placed all of these things. They got a grant from a filmmaker to put all of these around. And they decided to put those in, and the filmmaker happened to be Cecil B. DeMille's. Does anybody know, these things were placed in about 1955-56. What movie came out in 1956? The Ten Commandments. And so he sends these replicas to the capitals and to the state houses through the Fraternal Order of Eagles. Replicas of what? Okay. DeMille didn't use one of these things for the movie. Okay, there was a different one that Charlton Heston was carrying around. I don't think even Charlton Heston could have carried that around, okay? So there was a different prop. Unless God spoke to Moses using the King James Version of the translation, it wasn't a replica of what was on Mount Sinai. Whose Ten Commandments? Exodus, Deuteronomy give different wordings for the Ten Commandments. There's a Jewish, Catholic, various and Islamic versions of the same Ten Commandments. This is the problem that you get when the government starts to establish religion, because by definition, you're disestablishing everybody else. I don't know if disestablishing is a word, but okay. The expurgated text from John Paul Stevens of the King James Version of the Ten Commandments that they have crafted is unlikely to be accepted by Catholic parishes, Jewish synagogues, or even some Protestant denominations. The message the Eagles seek to convey is surely more compatible with the church property than on the government side of the metaphorical wall. So, Charlton Heston separating the Red Sea, okay, he should be able to separate church and state. What is the message? The message is, thou shalt not use the Ten Commandments to establish religion. But selling a movie is okay. Jesus, separate church and states. Give to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's. There you get any number of movies. Pontius Pilate, the provincial governor, as prosecutor. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. Constantine messes the whole thing up. See, Constantine gets to become God's broker. Emperors before Constantine wanted to become divine. So you get a deity-type status. The trouble is, and Constantine knew this very well, just because you became divine didn't mean you didn't get assassinated. So he thought, hey, I'm going to be God's broker. That's even better than being divine. This is the Nicene Council, the Nicene Creed in modern Turkey. It was Constantine, not the bishops of the Christian churches, that called this council. It was the state that called the council. Constantine called them for his own ends, not for the religious ends. But Constantine was a terrible human being. I mean, he put to death one of his sons. He poisoned one of his wives. Well, actually, he poisoned his son. I think he put his wife in a sauna and locked her up until she died. It's just a terrible guy. But he had a deathbed conversion, so I guess he gets to count as being in. But this is about being God's broker. John Milton comes around. What happened to rendering under God? Now, John Milton's a Puritan, and he's writing and talking at just the time that the Puritans are coming to America. Remember the Pilgrim Fathers and the Massachusetts Bay Colony? They're all reading Milton. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God. Constantine took things that were God's. Constantine sponsored the church, called the church councils, controlled church property, and appointed the bishops. Protestant Catholics were enthralled and seduced by Constantine's lavish superstition that church and state needed each other. John Milton is talking for a separation of church and state. The Pope, by the way, didn't used to be the Vicar of Christ. That was only until from 1057 on. Before, it was the Holy Roman Emperor who was the Vicar of Christ. It was Innocent III and then Gregory that started to assert, no, the Pope should be the Vicar of Christ. Christians should not suffer the two powers, the ecclesiastical and the civil, which are so totally distinct, to commit whoredom together. And that is W-H-O-R-E-D-O-M. This is pretty strong language. Now, the Puritans did not exactly create a theocracy. We kind of think about it as a theocracy, but they didn't. You have God, and you have the people and the rulers. Now, they were supposed to create the New Jerusalem, but it was kind of a system of checks and balances. The people could be a check on their governors, and the governors were a check on the people. So if the people failed God, the civil rule would reprimand. If the rule failed God or them, they could protest and disobey. This was all about the English Civil Wars, where the people, the Puritans, were fighting against the king. They took a page, church and state were a check for each other to achieve the godly end. They were separatists, nonconformists, meaning they were separate from the established Church of England. So eventually Charles I loses his head. And I am going to, if I can, do that again, because it took me a hell of a long time to figure out how to make PowerPoint do that. All right. Now, Jefferson gets credit for this terminology, separation of church and state, the wall of separation of church and state. It's not in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. Some people often will tell you that, oh, there's nothing in the Constitution that said there should be a separation of church and state. Well, okay. He wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut in 1802. They were asking for a day of fasting for national reconciliation after his terrible political campaign against John Adams, his former friend. I mean, you think anything nasty going on today compares? These guys were really nasty. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that the legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Now, I like to think of myself, I try to be a good writer. Jefferson was a good writer. What do good writers do? We steal metaphors wherever we can get them. Roger Williams in 1643 wrote, "The wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world." The wall protects religion. Now, it's interesting. We kind of think about, hey, we need this protection, this wall of protection between church and state, because we want to protect us from the encroachment of people establishing religions over us. In reality, it is at least as important, if not more important, to protect religion from the corruption of the government. So this kind of open prayer session stuff by political candidates, how much sincerity is, I cannot say. But it's very often done in order to get the support of whatever groups we're talking about. Mixing the government and religion is a whoredom. Okay, I think we already covered that. Okay. It's absurd that Christians have not learned to distinguish rightly between civil power and ecclesiastical. The combining of ecclesiastical and political government is equally destructive to both. Adams, who argued with Jefferson about a number of things, believed in the same thing. Nothing is more dreaded than the national government meddling with religion. I mix religion with politics as little as possible. As he is the first gentleman of the cloth who has appeared in Congress, somebody had given a prayer in invocation in one of the first Congresses. I cannot but wish he may be the last. Mixing the sacred character with that of the statesman is not attended with any good effects. Separation practice. When we use the term minister in the United States, we are usually using it in a religious context. A minister of whatever, minister of baptism, whatever. Oddly enough, in Europe, minister in England is used to refer to government officials as well. This shows a different cultural orientation of the United States. You know, Winston Churchill was the prime minister of England. We don't say that here. Minister comes from Old French, ministere, minister, in Latin meaning servant. Okay, so what happens with this Pilgrim legacy? The Declaration and Social Contract. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitles them. Well, what is that about? Jefferson has this idea of social contract, okay? We are talking about a contract between equals. That's what this concept of inalienable rights gets you to, right? But he hedges his bet. He calls on the laws of nature and of nature's God. Well, what's he talking about there? I think this is classic Jefferson, by the way. I think Jefferson was an atheist who just didn't tell anybody because it wasn't politically expedient, or it would have been impolite, or whatever, okay? I mean, I don't know that for sure, but that's just kind of the impression. But he always has to hedge his bet. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Franklin was the one who edited Jefferson's original version. Now, I actually think Franklin was a better writer than Jefferson. That's kind of heresy in some places. But he edited Jefferson's original draft. He said these rights are sacred and undeniable. And Franklin changed that to self-evident. It gives you a whole different foundation for the concept of individual rights. Not from God, perhaps from nature's God. They spoke about divine providence, the creator, the first cause, the grand architect. This is not the God of Thomas Aquinas. This is the God of Isaac Newton. Now, this is William Blake's picture of Newton. This is Newton, a man with his own intellect and the tools of his own device can use his mind to pierce the darkness. That's a very different concept of God. That's a deist God. Nature's God versus God's nature. Is God, if you look at here, this is another Blake. Here's the same compass that he had Isaac Newton have in his hands in his depiction of God, versus Michelangelo, the God who controls the heavens and seas and storms. Separating God from natural law. You've got Thomas Hobbes. Natural law is how a rational human being seeking to survive and prosper acts. Rousseau and Montesquieu followed, expanding this contractual approach to rights. And this is kind of a throwback to Aristotle. All right. So, do we have a Christian nation? History versus the culture wars. Now, the Puritans were founding a New Jerusalem. I think that's indisputable. Here's the Virginia Charter, 1606, which was not a Puritan colony. Virginia was found purely as a capitalistic venture to make habitation and to deduce a colony of sundry of our people into that part of America commonly called Virginia, and propagating of Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness. Which kind of the undercurrent there is, go ahead and steal everything and exploit it, but as long as you convert whoever survives to Christianity, it's okay. John Locke wrote the Carolina Constitution in 1669. No man could be a citizen unless he acknowledged God, belonged to a church, and refrained from abusive language against religion. So even John Locke, this great Enlightenment precursor, still is writing things like this in 1669. This is going back to Ferdinand and Isabella, gold, glory, and God as the justification. All right. Here's a painting. Yeah. The imagery is fascinating here because it's just so wrong. I mean, okay, I mean, you can take an historical term. Look, the free exercise clause lets you believe whatever you want about anything. But here you have the good people, Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Adams, and Jesus hanging out. They're hanging out behind Jesus. See, they're all in the good category. Ronald Reagan is up there too. Then you have Lucifer's hanging out here on the, kind of the left. He's hanging out here with a professor with a copy of The Origin of Species. And then you have Everson versus Board of Education, Marbury versus Madison, Roe versus Wade. That looks like Hugo Black as the judge down there. Okay, this is just some guy who painted this in his den. And you can buy copies of it all over the place if you want to hang it in your house. But what you have is this is a depiction of mythology. Now, if you ask me, did God inspire the Constitution and Bill of Rights? My answer is, I don't know. If you want to believe in God, then maybe God did. All I can tell you is that the people who wrote the Bill of Rights and the Constitution didn't think they were being inspired by God. Now, maybe they were. They just didn't leave any documentary evidence that they thought they were. All right. So, where does this take us? The revolutionary generation, by the 1770s, the established American Christianity was in decline. 1 in 10 members, only 1 in 10 people were a member of an established Christian church. This was also, though, the time of the Great Awakenings. You've got Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, co-founder of Methodism, along with John Wesley. Modern American evangelical Protestantism traces their roots from the Great Awakenings, not from the more traditional branches, kind of high Protestants. Regarding the Second Great Awakening, John Adams says, "Instead of the most enlightened people, I fear we Americans shall soon have the character of the silliest people under heaven." In 1789, religious leaders from New England wrote President George Washington that the Constitution lacked any reference to the only true God and Jesus Christ, who he hath sent. Washington responds, "The path of true piety is so plain as to require but little political direction. Only ministers of the gospel could further the advancement of true religion." It's kind of, again, let's keep the wall of separation of church and state up. Unanimous First Senate, Tripoli Treaty, 1779, passed by many of the same people who wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. As the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims, no pretext arising from religious opinion shall ever produce an eruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. Anybody kind of think there's an issue in the political debate right now about this? Well, what about the framers in religion? What did they really believe? They were actually mixed. John Jay, I would say, probably had kind of a more traditional Christian outlook. In the Federalist Papers, Americans are one united people professing the same Protestant religion. Thomas Paine, however, I believe in one God and no more. I believe in the equality of man, and I believe that religious duties consist of doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy. I do not believe in the creed professed by the Jewish church, the Roman church, by the Greek church, by the Turkish church, by the Protestant church, nor by any church that I know of. My own mind is my own church. Okay. I don't think Thomas Paine ever accepted Jesus Christ as a personal Savior. Turning the other cheek meant sinking man into a spaniel. Now, Thomas Paine was an enormously popular polemicist in his day and was widely read, not just by Thomas and Jefferson and Adams, but by the common person. Which Washington do you want to see? This is one of my sons in the kindergarten play, playing George Washington. The reason why this is ironic is you can see what of all my children, he has the most challenge with truth. So when he was up there saying, "I cannot tell a lie," it was kind of like, okay, good. Here's Washington kneeling during the dark days of Valley Forge. It was even on a postage stamp on the National Cathedral. Norman Rockwell does this great painting. There is absolutely no documentary evidence that George Washington ever knelt down and prayed at Valley Forge, or for that matter, any place else that we can tell. This is part of the American mythology and civil religion. Maybe he did, but there's just not documentary. And by the way, if he was going to do it anywhere, it was in Valley Forge, because things really looked bad at that point. I mean, we were on the road to losing the whole thing within the first year. All right. Again, part of the mythology. That somehow Washington and Abraham Lincoln are guiding George W. Bush in his decisions. This isn't a talk about Abraham Lincoln, but he didn't really believe God existed. He used to go into these melancholies about former women that he loved who died early, and he would be crushed because he felt he would never see them again. There was no afterlife that he was looking forward to. He did speak in beautiful metaphorical terms about the justice of the Almighty, but what he personally believed on all that in all indications is it didn't really work for him. He spoke in terms of metaphor. Washington spoke as a deist, providence, the almighty rule of the universe, the great architect of the universe, the great disposer of events. Joseph Ellis, Washington did not think much about heaven or angels. The only place he knew his body was going was into the ground, and as for his soul, its ultimate location was unknowable. He died as a Roman Stoic rather than as a Christian saint. I am no bigot myself to any mode of worship. Interesting. America didn't need toleration, according to Washington. To the Jews of the Toro Synagogue in 1790, not by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. So we don't tolerate people who believe differently than us. They have just as much right to what they believe in America as we have a right to what we believe. By the way, Washington and his tolerations. This is a depiction of Pope Day. It's called Guy Fawkes Day, part of the gunpowder plot of 1605. It's still celebrated in England as Bonfire Day because it has some pretty heavy anti-Catholic overtones. Fireworks night. V for Vendetta wore a Guy Fawkes mask. Okay. George Washington did away with the custom in the American armies, which caused the whole thing to kind of go out of favor throughout the colonies, which is why in America we don't have this anymore. November 17th. The ridiculous and childish custom of burning the effigy of the Pope. It also has a key strategic issue. It interfered with attempts to the friendship and alliance of the people of Canada, and later of the alliance with the French. Now, we would not have won the American Revolution without the French. If you notice, half the troops bottling up Cornwallis at Yorktown were French. What the framers believe. Adam, Congregationalist, Unitarian, Joseph Presley. When he was early on in his life, he wrote this little dissertation. The sensible Puritans established a government of the church more consistent with the scriptures and a government of the state more agreeable to the dignity of human nature. Middle-aged John Adams writes, there is a germ of religion in human nature so strong that whatever an order of men can persuade the people by flattery that they have salvation at their disposal, there can be no end to fraud, violence, or usurpation. John Adams is an old man. 20 times in the course of my late reading, I have been upon the point of breaking out, this would be the best of all possible worlds if there were no religion in it. But then he added, without religion, this world would be something not fit to be mentioned in polite company, I mean hell. Now you can see this progression going on throughout John Adams' life. What about Benjamin Franklin? Here is my creed. I believe in one God, the creator of the universe, that he governs the world by his providence, that he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we can render to him is doing good to his other children. These are the fundamental principles of all sound religion. These are the fundamental principles of all sound religion. I think the system of morals in his religion, as he left them to us, the best the world ever saw or is likely to see, but I apprehend it has received various corrupting changes. I have some doubts as to Jesus' divinity, though it is a question I do not dogmatize upon, having never studied it, and think it needless to busy myself with it now, when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing the truth with less trouble. Now, Franklin, if you want to study kind of a great diplomat, it is Benjamin Franklin. John Adams commented, the Catholics thought him almost a Catholic. The Church of England claimed him as one of them. The Presbyterians thought him half a Presbyterian, and the Friends believed him a wet Quaker. Thomas Jefferson didn't care if his neighbor believed in 20 gods or no God because it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. He cautions his nephew in 1787, shake off all the fears and servile prejudices under which weak minds are severely crouched, question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more approve of the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear. So is there God in the Constitution? There is no Church of the United States as there is a Church of England. Now, there are certain political reasons for that. John Locke's philosophy of government, authority from social conduct, the people are sovereign. This was all part of this fight with the Stuart kings, ending up with, of course, we the people as the source of legitimacy. We the people of the United States do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. Now, there are no tests. There's a specific test clause. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. This had to do with the Stuarts, who the Protestant parliaments had, basically disqualified Catholics. James the second declared himself to be a Catholic, created all kinds of problems, eventually leads to the English Civil War. After the English Civil War, Charles II, James takes it over, and he has to get deposed because of that, all the turmoil. All right. Oaths, there are oaths. There's an oath for president, Article 6, Clause 3, oaths for senators and representatives, state legislatures, all executive and judicial officers of the federal and state governments. But is that an oath to God? I mean, they add these things, so help me God, but really that's not in the Constitution. The American Baptists originally liked the idea that there was not a test clause. Reverend Isaac Buckus, nothing is more evident both in reason and the Holy Scriptures than that religion is ever a matter between God and individuals, and therefore no man or men can impose any religious test without invading the essential prerogatives of our Lord Jesus Christ. Modern American Baptists sometimes say things very differently. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story explained about Article 6, for Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and even the infidel to sit down at the common table of the national councils without any inquisition into their faith or mode of worship is what America provides. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The states, however, were free to be as bigoted as they always were. States supported established clergy in buildings with universal taxation. If you lived in Connecticut, you had to pay the tithe regardless of whether you believed or belonged to that church. Now, American colonies were formerly under the Church of England, but the charters from the colonies, the descents of the Atlantic Ocean allow for a great deal of diversity. Generally, Puritanism, which became Congregationalism, was in the north. Anglicanism, later Episcopalianism, was predominant in the south. Of course, the free exercise clause allowed that the federal government would not favor one over the other. So there was a good political reason for doing that as well. Here's the Vermont Constitution. Legislatures had to declare, I do believe in one God, the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good and the punisher of the wicked, and I do acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration and own and profess the Protestant religion. If you didn't swear to this, you couldn't hold public office and probably couldn't vote. Catholics are out, Jewish persons are out, and every other ism is out as well. Now, part of this, though, is a bit deceptive. The churches were the main social service agencies of their day. So your tithe, your tax, went to support not only the clergy and the buildings, but they also went to support hospitals, orphanages, poorhouses, social welfare, and public education. This argument that often gets made that, the framers didn't believe that there should be government-sponsored social services is actually not right. They just had a different mechanism for providing it. So the Social Security Administration or whatnot. What is English supposed longest words? Anti-disestablishmentarianism? Okay. This was a movement in English to disestablish the established church. And if you're anti-disestablishmentarianism means you were anti the disestablishment of the church. Okay? Back to establishment. So, remember this Dairy Queen commercial where that kid says anti-disestablishmentarianism? No? Oh, okay. You guys didn't watch enough TV as kids. All right. All right, Jefferson. The people may be safely trusted to hear everything true and false and to form a correct judgment between them. John Stuart Mill. The idea that truth would triumph falsehood in a free society is nothing more than a piece of idle sentimentality. All right. All of went homes, though. But when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. That, at any rate, is the theory of our Constitution. For writing cool stuff like that, he got his own postage stamp, and to my knowledge is the only Supreme Court justice that has a movie about him, although I think there's one coming out about Ginsburg now. But notice what he says. The marketplace of ideas will not always produce the truth, only the best test of truth. So we're not guaranteed by free speech. It's just the opposite. Doesn't really give us anything satisfactory. Justice Robert Jackson, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. Okay, well, what about religion and American public life? So what's a humanist to do? The framers and religion, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Religion and virtue are the only foundation of republicanism and of all free governments. Franklin, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. All right, now, certainly Franklin was not these men were not particularly personally pious, but they did see the value, at least in their public statements here, of religion and society. If men are so wicked as they are now, as we now see them with religion, what would they be if without it? Washington, reason and experience both forbid us to expect national morality can prevail in the exclusion of religious principle. True religion affords governments its sure support. Alexis de Tocqueville, while the law allows the American people to do everything, there are things which religion prevents them from imagining and forbids them to dare. Which brings us to the Scopes monkey trial. By the way, I have a prerogative that I can kind of just jump centuries around whenever I want to talk. 1925, John Scopes went on trial for teaching evolution. He violated the Butler Act. Unlawful in state-funded schools to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. George Washington Butler, who was the author of it, said, "I don't know anything about evolution. I had read in the papers that boys and girls were coming home from school and telling their fathers and mothers that the Bible was all nonsense." William Jennings Bryan, "The Christian parents of the state owe you a debt of gratitude for saving their children from the poisonous influence of an unproven hypothesis." Okay, so there sets up the Butler Act and the Scopes monkey trial. By the way, the whole thing was a publicity stunt. It was dreamed up by the Dayton Chamber of Congress in order to get attention for Dayton, Tennessee. The ACLU wanted a test case. So, oh, by the way, I forgot to mention the ACLU is co-sponsoring us today. So please visit the table as well. All right. So they had all this thing designed. They had the press called. William Jennings Bryan, Clarence Darrow's grandstanding hijacked the whole trial. It took the ACLU another 40 years to challenge the issue. Scopes gets convicted, and he's reversed on a technicality. His fine was paid by somebody else. Eventually, you get Epperson versus Arkansas, which invalidates Arkansas's law. McLean versus Arkansas, then Edwards versus Aguillard in the Supreme Court, basically saying, look, evolution should be taught as science. It's not religion, and other things that profess to be science are not. So what do you have? Shall we meet again? Shall we three meet again? All right. Of course, you have Inherit the Wind, Clarence Darrow's cross-examination of William Jennings Bryan on the Bible's inconsistencies was depicted by Frederick March and Spencer Tracy in the movie with Harry Morgan, who later on becomes Colonel Potter in MASH, right? Whether God exists has nothing to do with how God chose to create nature, create man and nature. Creationists seems to make God's existence contingent upon disproving Darwinism, but most philosophers of religion say it's kind of an irrelevant question. So there's the origin of species. Now, Bryan is easy to ridicule, but we should remember things about William Jennings Bryan. He was a great social reformer. He dominated the populist wing of the Democratic Party, 3 times Democratic candidate for President of the United States. Woodrow Wilson, Secretary of State, resigned because of his pacifist position in World War I, advocate of popular democracy, fought for women's suffrage. So a lot of people here may not have had the vote, but for William Jennings Bryan. Enemy of banks and the gold standard, he demanded free silver because it put more money in people's hands. Faith in the wisdom of the common people. Those were the principles by which he lived his life. He was called the Great Commoner. Now, he was a Christian humanitarian and a pacifist. Linked Darwinism to what he considered to be might makes right philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Evolution justified harming the weak and waging war. The theory of evolution was not just an explanation for injustice, but an excuse for injustice, according to William Jennings Bryan. Well, what are we talking about in the Scopes monkey trial? Scopes was teaching from a textbook called The Civic Biology Presented in Problems by George William Hunter. Well, what does Hunter write? Here's Hunter's things on the races of man. At the present time, there exist upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from the other in instinct, social customs, and to an extent in structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type, originating in Africa, the Malay or brown race from the islands of the Pacific, the American Indian, the Mongolian or yellow race, including the natives of China, Japan, and Eskimos, and finally, the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represent the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. Well, let's just go on with this. I'll take some time. Improvement of man. If the stock of domesticated animals can be improved, it is not unfair to ask if the health and vigor of the future generations of men and women on the earth might not be improved by applying to them the laws of selection. This improvement of the nature of the future race has a number of factors in which we as individuals may play a part. These are personal hygiene, selection of healthy mates, and the betterment of the environment. I don't know if you were selecting your mate with some of these things in mind, but you maybe should have. Parasitism and the cost to society. Hundreds of families such as those described above exist today, spreading disease, immorality, and crime to all parts of this country. The cost to society of such families is very severe. Just as certain animals or plants become parasitic on other plants or animals, these families have become parasitic in society. They not only do harm to others by corrupting, stealing, or spreading disease, but they are actually protected and cared for by the state out of public money. Largely for them, the poorhouse and the asylum exists. They take from society, but they give nothing in return. They are true parasites. Okay, improvement of the race. It has a number of factors in which we as individuals may take part. Better environments, and of course the hundreds of families are living like this because of course they choose to live like that because of their parasitic nature. Eugenics. When people marry, there are certain things that the individual as well as the race should demand. The most important of these is freedom from germ diseases which might be handed down to the offspring, tuberculosis, syphilis, that dreaded disease which cripples and kills hundreds of thousands of innocent children, epilepsy, and feeble-mindedness are handicaps which it is not only unfair but criminal to hand down to posterity. The science of being well-born is called eugenics. The remedy, if such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow us to do this, but we have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums or other places in various ways, preventing intermarriage and the possibilities of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. Remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe, are now meeting with success in this country. All right. Remedies of this sort have been tried in Europe successfully in Europe and now meeting with success in this country. Well, we all kind of know where that led to. Perhaps we should be a little bit more charitable to William Jennings Bryan, because for him it was not just about a monkey. He was talking about a whole range of things. Certainly, he's utterly foolish on this whole issue about religion and biology and the theory of evolution, but he's also talking about where this leads society to. Let's talk about the culture wars and religion today. Hobby Lobby. Or the case of Jesus Christ Superstore. That's one of those ones I wish I would have just stole, but John Stewart came up with it, so I have to give him credit. The culture wars are over. Most Americans agree that there should be legalized same-sex marriage. There should be contraceptions. Most Americans agree in access to abortion and no public prayer in schools. All the polling data shows this. So what are you going to do if you're a failed culture warrior? Let's recast the culture wars as religious freedom. Definitions and defining debate. In the Hobby Lobby case, nobody argued that contraceptives were preventive health care. None of the sides argued that. That was a loser argument. Most Americans believe in preventive health care. Most Americans believe in using contraceptives. Arguments against these are a political loser. Americans also believe in religious freedom. So let's recast our debate as a debate of religious freedom. Now, I find this bothersome on a couple of levels, one of which is it is an unfair attack of a certain political position. It also cheapens religious freedom. Constitutional arguments beat political arguments. I originally wrote this constitutional arguments trump political arguments, but right now I decided to keep it beat. See, I support religious freedom. Hobby Lobby casts as a debate between religious and reproductive freedom. It's constitutionalizing the political argument is what's going on. It creates the myth of an anti-religious tyranny that is pounding out. The courts are undemocratically pounding out the rights of religious freedom. All of the issues of the culture wars, however, the Supreme Court is actually behind public opinion. The case recognizing same-sex marriage is behind public opinion. Public opinion's already been there for years now. What is religious freedom as a religious right? The Free Exercise Clause affords an individual protection from certain forms of government compulsion. It does not afford an individual the right to dictate the conduct of the government's internal procedures. That's Lang versus Northwest Indian Creamery and Protective Association, a 1990 case. Churches, per se, do not own the right. Individuals own the right. Now, many individuals, like Catholics, belong to collectivist religions. But it's really the individual Catholic who has the right that allows the structure of the church in the American polity. Freedom of religion lets you believe anything you want. If you want to believe that the Constitution was written by pixie elves, you have a perfect constitutional right to do that. Freedom of religion lets you say almost anything you want, and it lets you be free from government reprisal and prior restraint. Freedom of religion lets you engage in most, but not all conduct. And it's the mixing up of these basic boundaries that people kind of get wrong. What are the boundaries? Okay. Aztec sacrifice is out. If I believe sincerely and deeply that plunging my obsidian dagger in your heart, in your chest, and pulling out your heart is the only thing that makes the sun rise, too bad for me. You just don't get to do Aztec sacrifice. Polygamy is out. Reynolds versus United States. Can a man exercise his practices contrary to the law because of his religious beliefs? To permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land, and in effect to permit every citizen to become a law unto himself. Government could exist only in name under such circumstances. Regarding religious liberty, government is not forcing anyone to use or not use contraception. Government is not forcing any religion to conduct same-sex ceremonies. Government is not forcing anyone to pray or not pray in school. Government is not forcing anyone to have or not have an abortion. If it is a religious right, that is the end of the inquiry. Now, I will tell you that if the government started forcing a church, say Orthodox Jews or the Catholic Church or whatever, to perform same-sex marriage as a religious rite, that is a violation of freedom of religion. But what the state does should not be controlled by those things. What are the boundaries of behavior? Can a county clerk deny a same-sex couple a marriage license? Well, can a Catholic clerk deny a Protestant a marriage license or a Protestant deny a Catholic a marriage license? We would say no. Can a Christian clerk deny a Muslim couple a marriage license? And my favorite is, can a traditional Inuit clerk deny Sarah Palin a hunting license? Which would be, no moose stew tonight. Because, you know, the Inuits, of course, believe that women should never hunt. And if women hunt, it could just, like, totally destroy the fabric of the universe. Men hunt in their religious belief. Well, we just don't allow that, and Sarah gets to have moose stew. Can a racist judge uphold the conviction of Richard and Mildred Loving for violating Virginia Racial Integrity Act of 1924? Leon M. Basil had a very deep religious belief. Almighty God created the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents, and but for the interference with his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix. We don't go for this. By the way, this is the second time today you've heard the term Malay, which is remarkable. It used to be a term, you'd never hear Malay anymore. But here it is in this opinion. This is a religious statement. There's no reason to doubt the sincerity of his religious belief that blacks and whites should not marry. But we don't allow that religious belief to control what is American, what's government policy. Sure, you can believe that. But if you're providing a public service, we don't say, and for some reason this is all centered on cake decorators, which is a pretty small part of the population, right? It would be absurd to say, I'm a cake decorator and I do not believe black and white people should not marry. And for that matter, I'm not too happy about Protestants and Catholics marrying either. Well, we wouldn't allow that. Why then is this argument made that, oh, they can't be forced to make a same-sex couple? Personally, I think you should let the market just take care of it. If you want to cut yourself out of this huge wedding market that just came in, fine. But okay, that's for some reason we have that debate. All right. This, of course, was Loving versus Virginia, the best named case in the history of the Supreme Court. I did a considerable amount of research, this slogan, Virginia's for lovers, if it had something to do with that, and I have not found a link, but I will find one someday that it relates to this case. And the answer is no. Now, the other interesting thing about Loving versus Virginia, and my point about the culture wars, is the Supreme Court was way ahead of popular public opinion at the time. This is a great Warren Court decision. It took, from the social science data and the analysis of this, 15 years for public opinion to reach the point where most people agreed with the court's position. Conversely, with the same-sex marriage case, the court's way behind public opinion. I mean, the opinion was no great profile in courage. Okay, well, who is God now? Or what's a humanist to do? I first gave part of this talk to the humanists of Greater Phoenix. And I think this is particularly relevant to this group here. The free exercise clause, okay? Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise. What does religion mean today? Modern technology is the age of Prometheus, but it is not without its consequences. Remember, Prometheus brought fire to man, but he got stuck chained to a rock and had a vulture or an eagle eat his liver all day, and then it regrows in night, you know, because he's a titan and he gets his liver to grow back, just to be eaten the next day. I mean, that was a pretty crummy existence for giving fire to man. We have eaten from the tree of knowledge. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it, you will surely die. You're cast from Eden at that point. Maybe Bryant has something more in common with Thomas More. I die the king's good servant and God's first. See, Henry VIII had supplanted God. God got replaced. Who or what is our God now? I fear the day that technology will surpass our human interaction. The world will have a generation of idiots. Need I say any more? Into what will we evolve? There's the impact of technology on society. Oh, brave new world. Miranda in William Shakespeare's The Tempest. Oh, wonder how many goodly creatures are there here. How beauteous mankind is, oh brave new world that has such people in it. Now, Miranda was looking at some pretty coarse sailors that were hardly the cream of society, but she was so impressed with humanity, which is part of the irony that Shakespeare gave us. Well, Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, 1932. London, 632 years after Ford, anticipates reproductive technology, sleep limiting, psychological manipulation, and classical conditioning, losing individual identity in a fast-paced future. Negative themes, the culture of youth, commercialization, sexual promiscuity, and the inward-looking nature of Americans. How many dystopian science fiction movies are based on the idea that we just lost control of technology? Where are the boundaries? How do we, again, form those boundaries? The Matrix, Matrix Revolution, The Terminator, Battlestar Galactica. Will our technology be better than us? Will it be hotter than us? Ex Machina. Did anybody see that? I found that a disturbing movie because you have somebody, well, very attractive, I don't want to be a spoiler here, but with no moral or social convention controls who eventually gets unleashed on the world. Bryant worried about eugenics. We have cloning. Reproductive technology. DNA plays a primary role in determining social status in the movie Gattaca. No democracy, but an oligarchy of the genetically privileged. Can democracy survive in that world? At least from the statements that I gave you before from these folks, it's very problematic. Inherit the wind. He that troubleth his own house shall inherit the wind. Open the pod bay door, Hal. Have we inherited the wind? I guess that's the question that I'll leave you with. What was the role of religion? And I think it's incumbent, especially on this group, to think about, okay, what do we provide as some kind of human foundation in order to keep our cell phones from basically taking us over? So, that's all I have. Any questions?
I believe, and I presume that you and the others believe, that freedom of speech and religion and press and all this means also freedom of thought. It's included, it's self-evident. It precedes the religion, what you think. However, you haven't touched political. You talk a lot about religion, but not about politics. So here are my questions. How would you explain the phenomenon in this country, just a few years ago, in my lifetime at least, McCarthy, the whole phenomena?
Okay, how do you explain McCarthyism? I am sorry to say I have a whole nother talk on that issue. But the bottom line comes to this. We don't always stay true to ourselves as Americans. We have a basis what's great about America is we have the criterion from which to judge our own failings. And McCarthyism was a failing. By the way, it's very similar to Athenian democracy that ended up putting Socrates to death. It was a failing in the principles. Our treatment of Native Americans, our treatment of black people in this country is a failing. And it was a known hypocrisy at the times. And those hypocrisies come up all the time. There's structures we have in place to try to prevent that. But I think it's incumbent upon us to denounce that wherever we see. But you also have to recognize its failings. What I'm going to say is not original to me. It was another metaphor that I wished I would have come up with, but I'm glad to steal it. You got to read the books about what happened in history. I hate this idea of let's clean our textbooks up for kids so we don't talk about these things. How can you turn a page on history if you didn't read the page? So again, I wished I would have come up with that mold for now. Well, I heard it from Bill Maher, but I think he must have stole it from somebody else too. So, okay.
Still exist in reality legally. If this was something that I wanted to
Okay.
talk about, which I was not allowed. But
Right.
Okay, I'll tell you what. If we have time, we'll come back. We'll come back to you. Okay. Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question about freedom of speech at political rallies. If a presidential candidate rents a hall and is giving a speech and protesters interrupt and drown out the candidate and disrupt, do they actually have a right to do that at that particular time and place? Or could they be arrested, say, for inciting a riot or disorderly conduct or so on?
I will give you a clear, straight answer that's a great lawyer answer. It depends. Okay, look, it depends. I think we all know who we're talking about here. If a private candidate rents a private hall, they have a certain more power to restrict. I also think it says something about them, and let the political process judge them for that. Speech is, I'm pretty much a free speech absolutist, but speech is subject to certain time, place, and manner restrictions. I mean, to give one boundaries. Let's say I want a speech, and I want to really communicate a message to you. I'm probably not allowed at 3 in the morning to take a bullhorn outside of your yard and start yelling at you in your house, okay? That's just not free speech, right? So you'd have to judge that versus the laws in effect in the state where he is and the whole situation. Is there any public monies being taken? All kinds of difficult factors go in. But, you know, it's politically stupid for most candidates to do that, and I think it's even stupid for the candidate, although he seems to get some juice from that. I think it's ultimately dumb for his way of doing that. And by the way, the one guy who, you know, kind of punched that kid in the whole thing, I think he's being criminally charged, as he should be. You don't get to assault people in those contexts. So, yeah.
Can I not be on?
Oh.
I don't want to be. Okay. Thank you.
We could disguise your voice, go like.
That's all right. I wanted to ask about, in terms of religious freedom and I guess case histories, there's been a lot of cases that have come up, you know, which involve the Christian religion and, you know, the rights that are, you know, they say are being denied. And I wondered, I recall that in the past there's been some things regarding, say, Native American religious freedom and the use of peyote. And I always thought that in some of these cases about freedom of religion, especially with the Christian religion, whether or not, you know, the ACLU or any organization or a person would be able to bring cases or should bring cases to really test that are regarding minority religions, that are established religions, but minority religions. For example, you know, Jewish people could say that they have a right not to be forced to work after a certain hour on Friday because it violates the Sabbath. And, you know, Muslims have a right to pray 5 times a day, you know, in wherever they're working. And I just wondered what your opinion was about that.
Well, you raise a very interesting issue. A lot of people, well, first of all, I'm going to go back to the Hobby Lobby case. Reading the Hobby Lobby case as a constitutional lawyer, I have to tell you, it's not a particularly significant case. it's not based on the First Amendment freedom of religion. It's based on the Freedom Restoration Act. It's based on a statute of Congress which can be changed at the stroke of a pen. The Freedom Restoration Act was an attempt to overturn an opinion by Anton Scalia and Smith, which denied the Native American Church and the use of peyote as a sacrament in supporting of the power of government at the expense of religious liberty. Now, a lot of people don't realize that about Anton Scalia, but he was very much in the pro-government camp in that case and wrote the opinion. Then they passed the RFRA, which Bill Clinton signed into law, and it's that statute that was signed kind of to protect Native Americans and the use of the Native American Church and peyote that the Hobby Lobby family then used to bring that case on the contraceptive mandate in Obamacare. So, and of course then Scalia was all behind that and helping that. So there was a real inconsistency in Anton Scalia's jurisprudence there that was pretty evident to see. So I think your question is getting at the question of what are the rights of minorities in their free practice of religion. And I think there's a tacit recognition in the law that maybe those get a little more attention in the protection of free exercise of religion. But that's always in a state of flux. As far as the ACLU, they're always bringing suits like that. I can guarantee you that. They spend a lot of time on that issue. So, yeah.
If money is speech, does the court have to go through the whole thing again to decide what kind of regulations you have to put on money being speech? Like, can money yell fire?
If money is speech, well, look, I hate that idea that money is speech. I mean, but that's the prevailing thing. The interesting thing, really, the open question right now in the post-Citizens United world is, okay, you have the right to speech. Money is part of your speech or your expression. Do you have the right to anonymity? Anton Scalia, oddly enough, who was all behind Citizens United, did say that the First Amendment doesn't give you the right to anonymity in your speech. And the public square, you had a right to say anything you ought to say, but you didn't have a right to say it without people knowing who you were. Now, cutting against that, of course, is a lot of the founding generation were very happy to do things anonymously. Remember, the Federalist Papers were written by Publius, kind of I think everybody knew who was writing them, but at least officially they were anonymous, so people didn't know Jay, Hamilton, and Madison were working on them. But I really come to the conclusion, okay, if you're going to live in a post-Citizens United world, then we as a part of a democracy should know who's spending that money. And I think it goes a step further. If you have stock in a corporation that's starting to contribute, as a shareholder, you must demand where that money from your corporation is going, because I think you have a right to as part of corporate law and good governance function of a given corporation. So, yeah, sorry.
Very good presentation. Thank you very much. I have a question about the Pledge of Allegiance, which we do say at secular government meetings, you know, when it says, I pledge allegiance under the flag, blah, 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 and then it says, under God. And I want to know, whose God are we talking about?
Okay, the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, symbols of speech and religion. Those of you who are looking forward to lunch, I'm sorry, but here we go. The Pledge of I pledge allegiance to the flag. Francis Bellamy wrote it as a children's recitation for the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. There was no reference to either God or the United States in the original Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to my flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, anybody know what the original salute was for the Pledge of Allegiance? Yeah. In 1923 and 1944, the National Flag Conference claimed that immigrants would confuse the words "my flag" and added "of the United States of America." In 1942, Congress recognized the Pledge of Allegiance. Under God. In April 22nd, 1951, the Catholic Knights of Columbus added "under God," and Congress did it in 1954 to attack the atheistic and materialistic concepts of communism with its attendant subservience of the individual. Now, okay, fine. You do, of course, communism is a utilitarian social structure. You do, of course, all realize that so is capitalism. Okay, here's the original Bellamy salute. Okay, March 1941. World War II kind of put that type of thing a little out of favor. With its attendance from Soviets, Eisenhower. From this day forward, millions of our school children will daily proclaim in every city and town, every village and rural schoolhouse, the dedication of our nation and our people to the Almighty. In this way, we are affirming the transcendence of religious faith in America's heritage and future. In this way, we shall constantly strengthen those spiritual weapons which forever will be our country's most powerful resource in peace or in war. Okay. 2002, the Ninth Circuit held the statute unconstitutional. Senate unanimously denounced the decision. George Bush said it was ridiculous. Tom DeLay sad and absurd. Daschle, it was nuts, and Robert Byrd called the judges stupid. Okay? So, that... There we go. Okay, wait. All right. Sorry there. Okay, anyway. So that pledge... By the way, my personal thing about the Pledge of Allegiance that I've never particularly understood, and I don't have any lack of reverence for the flag or anything like that. I think burning it is a right of free speech, but it's also politically stupid because everybody watches you burn the flag and doesn't listen to what you say. Okay, fine. But why do we say, I pledge allegiance to the flag? We should say, I pledge allegiance to the republic. And the flag is its symbol or something like that. Why do you pledge allegiance to the flag? And then the second part is, and to the country for which it stands. I always thought, just as a syntax matter, it should be the other way around. But okay, that's... Anyway, I don't know if that answered your question, but that's just one of the things I have queued up in case.
Okay, let's thank Bob again for his wonderful presentation. He has a book for sale in the back. He'd be happy to sell because I think his children need help. Okay, so please, and then some of us go to lunch in room 2500C at the cafeteria. Okay, I'd like to see you there.